Motion number 2 on sanctions. I call the Minister to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the House has considered the Syria Sanctions EU Exit Amendment Number 2 Regulations 2024. This instrument amends the Syria Sanctions Regulations of 2019. The instrument was laid on the 30th of July using powers provided by the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018. It entered into force on the 31st of July. Madam Deputy Speaker, for clarity, the instrument was laid on the 24th of May under the previous government. As with the previous, the government supports the aims of this instrument, so we revoked and relayed it to provide additional time post-election for the required parliamentary scrutiny. There are no amendments to the policy, and the substance of this instrument is the same. Madam Deputy Speaker, with the conflict in Syria now in its 14th year, the humanitarian situation remains dire. A record 16.7 million people are estimated to be in humanitarian need. 9 in 10 people in Syria are living in poverty. Nearly 13 million lack sufficient food. Many more have been forced to flee their homes and are living in settlements and camps. Our support for the Syrian people is unwavering. The UK has spent over £4 billion to date, our largest ever response to a single humanitarian crisis, and we continue to provide life-saving support to those in need. It is imperative that aid reaches the most vulnerable, that UN agencies, international organisations and NGOs have the support necessary for their work. The UK has engaged with financial institutions and humanitarian actors to fully understand and mitigate the impact of the humanitarian provisions in our sanctions legislation, including by issuing general licensings following the earthquakes in February last year. The UK has acted to ensure that aid continues to reach those most in need. These amendments to the regulations will allow trusted organisations to focus on delivering aid, support efficient and effective humanitarian delivery, and provide reassurance for those organisations and their services providers. They will ensure that we continue to meet our humanitarian objectives while ensuring that our sanction regime is robust. UK sanctions are designed to encourage the Assad regime to refrain from actions, policies or activities which repress the civilian population in Syria. They also serve to encourage the regime to participate in good faith in negotiations for a political settlement in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254 and to bring about a peaceful solution to the conflict in Syria. Madam Deputy Speaker, this instrument amends the humanitarian exception to the petroleum measures contained in the 2019 regulations with the aim of improving the delivery of humanitarian aid in Syria. The amendments will expand the eligibility for the humanitarian exception from solely UK-funded persons to all organisations covered by UN Security Council Resolution 2664 to the extent that these are captured by UK sanctions. This extension will enable more organisations to benefit from the humanitarian exception. The instrument extends the regulations to ensure it applies to those involved in the humanitarian delivery chain. This change will ensure the delivery chain of relevant persons, as outlined in the regulations, will benefit from being able to use that exception. This provides assurances to relevant delivery partners on the ground and to financial service providers when improving payments. The instrument also amends the 2019 regulations to authorise financial service providers of relevant persons to use the humanitarian exception, removing the requirement for financial service providers to apply for individual licences to facilitate activities authorised by the exception. This change will also provide greater assurance to both humanitarian organisations and their financial providers, reducing delays in payments. In addition, the instrument replaces the existing notification requirement for relevant persons using the humanitarian exception for petroleum prohibitions in the 2019 regulations, with a new requirement to notify the Treasury on an annual basis that they are involved in the provision of humanitarian assistance in Syria. The notification requirement will apply to relevant persons conducting humanitarian assistance activities in Syria, but not to financial service providers, the UN, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, the British Red Cross, or to downstream delivery partners. Finally, the instrument makes 2 further and more minor amendments. The first of these is a small amendment to the humanitarian fuel exception and a related exception for petroleum products for diplomatic and consular premises in the 2019 regulations. Those exceptions are amended to refer to acquiring fuel rather than purchasing it. The second amends the record-keeping requirements within the regulations with respect to trade licence, to clarify that specified information is required where appropriate. This will ensure correct records are kept for the relevant licences. Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, UK sanctions on Syria continue to send a clear message to the regime and its supporters. We will not stand by while they commit serious human rights abuses. These regulations ensure that those sanctions do not hinder humanitarian aid efforts. We will continue to work closely with the UN, like-minded states, humanitarian organisations and the financial sector to ensure that these sanctions work in tandem with humanitarian efforts and that the Assad regime, its allies and supporters bear responsibility for the devastation endured by the Syrian people. I commend the regulations to the House.
The question is as on the order paper. Shadow Minister Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The people of Syria have suffered unimaginable horrors since 2011. First under Bashar al-Assad's brutal dictatorship, then at the hands of Daesh, Al-Qaeda, Iranian-backed militias and the Wagner Group. The Syrian people have endured unforgivable cruelty and suffering, with now over 6 million Syrians being forced abroad as refugees, 7 million are displaced within their own country and 90% live within poverty. Over half lack access to clean and safe water, and it is a humanitarian catastrophe. This catastrophe stems from Bashar al-Assad's oppressive authoritarian rule and industrialised brutalisation of his own people. And sadly, the earthquakes in February 2023 caused further suffering and directly impacted a further 9 million people. It is absolutely right that we continue to sanction Assad and his regime, but we must also ensure that much-needed humanitarian aid is delivered. The instrument for debate today was initially proposed before the election as a means of improving the humanitarian exemption from sanctions for those providing vital aid to Syria. It will give humanitarian organisations access to fuel, ensuring they're able to carry out important work. And so I'm grateful to the Minister for retabling the instrument, which of course we will support. The sanctions regime delivered under the Conservative government rightly targets those who have caused this appalling humanitarian disaster, not the rule-abiding NGOs, international organisations and accredited individuals helping to alleviate the suffering. Introducing an automatic humanitarian exemption rather than by licence and extending the earthquake exemptions of 2023 is something humanitarian groups have requested through the tri-sector group and these changes will now extend to fuel. Of course, we will expect the Minister and his officials to maintain clear protections to prevent from the misuse of this exemption, and we will monitor its implementation. Sadly, Madam Deputy Speaker, new crises are emerging at an alarming rate, but we must never forget the people of Syria. Whilst Assad and his Russian backers may be content to let the people of Syria suffer, the UK has a proud humanitarian legacy, regardless of which party is in government, and these changes will help to ensure its continuation. On the topic of our Syria sanctions regime, I would ask the Minister to use his position to look into the proliferation of Captagon, a highly addictive amphetamine. The success of global sanctions in cutting off Assad's regime from funding has led him to turn Syria into a narco state. It produces 80% of the world's Captagon. Indeed, in my view, Syria has become the Amazon warehouse for terrorists and states who behave like terrorists. Now, there was some hope that the normalisation of relations between several Arab countries and the Syrian regime might see this addressed. When in government, we opposed this normalisation, and I'd be grateful if the Minister confirmed this will be the position adopted by his government. Despite Captagon causing the most damage in countries, of course, neighbouring to Syria, it is also starting to affect those across the world. And I'm concerned that having been discovered in the Netherlands, and my own committee did an inquiry on this, that we are starting to see it in the UK. Addiction and misery are now bankrolling Assad's continued tyranny and indulgence of Putin's Russia, and we must make sure that we take action on Captagon so that we are protected here in the UK. We cannot forget Syria and the Syrian people, and anyone who's worked on Syria knows that we are haunted by our failures, the survivors we met, and the photos of those who were murdered. Rarely is Syria discussed in this place since the shameful vote of 2015, and so I take this opportunity to request a few clarifications of the government on their policy. First, I ask the Minister to take forward and give his government support for a new chemical weapons tribunal. A treaty-based court which will put on trial those guilty for such heinous inhumanity and deliver accountability and justice for those in Syria. Likewise, I would urge him to keep his eye on Daesh, because we are seeing a re-emergence of that evil in the caves and the mountains along the border between Iraq and Syria. Indeed, there were 153 attacks in the first 6 months of this year, and we know they are seeking every opportunity they are. And finally, I ask the Minister to urge his office and his voice to speak up for those who Assad seeks to silence, because hope lives on in Syria, as we have seen by the women-led protests across that country, as recently in protests in August. This instrument, originally laid by the Conservative government and brought to the House today, welcomes and provides exemptions for humanitarian groups to access fuel under strict management systems. We give it our full support, and we hope it can go some way to addressing the misery that the Syrian people have endured for too long, and supports those who are working to alleviate that suffering. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Richard Foord.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I would like to echo, first of all, what we've heard already about the effect that this dreadful war has had on the people of Syria. We understand that 300,000 civilians have been killed since the war broke out in 2011, and that more than 13 million people have either been displaced internally or have had to leave Syria as refugees. We've been talking this afternoon about sanctions and about how we might tighten the noose on trade and on financial transactions. Of course, when we tighten a noose, if we see the situation on the ground improving, then we might need to loosen it. But actually what's happening on the ground in Syria is still appalling. More on that later. First of all, I would just want to say that bilateral aid between the UK and Syria has been falling in recent years, from a high of £300 million in 2020, 205 million the following year, 158 million in 2022, and 150 million last year. So we've seen the falling by half of our bilateral humanitarian aid to Syria. And I question whether perhaps one of the reasons for that may have been because of concerns around co-option of humanitarian aid. It's a concern that was flagged in a report in 2019 by Human Rights Watch called Rigging the System, which pointed out that the Syrian government of al-Assad had co-opted reconstruction funding in Syria and, quote, had developed a policy and a legal framework that allows it to co-opt humanitarian assistance and reconstruction funding to fund its atrocities, to advance its own interests, and to punish those perceived as opponents. Now, we understand that this SI that has been laid this afternoon is specifically about carve-outs for petrol for humanitarian workers. And I'm sure that the government will have assured itself that these humanitarian workers will not be siphoning some of the fuel to the Syrian government. But I would ask the Minister that he offers and reinforces that reassurance when he comes back to the dispatch box. Finally, we heard earlier today that there have been strikes in Syria, and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has suggested that this was a strike on a programme of the development of short and medium-range precision missiles and drones allegedly carried out by Israel. If this is so, then it is the same site that was struck in 2017 when a suspected Israeli strike was on a rebel-held town in northern Syria. Finally, could the Minister suggest that by supporting humanitarian groups and humanitarian organisations, we aren't in any sense affording the al-Assad regime access to fuel his dreadful crimes in Syria? Thank you.
Maiden speech, Charlie Maynard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you also to the previous maiden speakers of Macclesfield and Great Yarmouth, who gave us very different views of their constituencies but were linked by their love for them. I'm standing here today to represent the people of Witney constituency, and I'm incredibly grateful for them for electing me to represent them, and I will do my best for them. I'm also incredibly grateful for the people who helped me get here. We had a fantastic team that worked extremely hard to do that. So thank you all. And I'm also extremely grateful for my very large family up there. I love you all too. Until this July, Witney voted Conservative for 102 years. Famous parliamentarians from Witney include Douglas Hurd and David Cameron. And I owe David Cameron a backhanded vote of thanks because some of the decisions he made put me on the path to politics. I also want to thank Robert Courts, who worked very hard for the constituency for the last 8 years, so thank you. Our constituency is beautiful. It sits at the bottom of the Cotswolds. It's full of market towns like Farringdon, Burford and Witney that did well off the wool trade, and they did more than trade it. They spun it, they wove it, and it made it into beautiful blankets which were famous throughout Europe since the Middle Ages. Then the dastardly duvet came along, and that was the end of it. But at its best, Witney innovated, and we've got a lot of Methodist roots in town, and they shared technology, and they cared about welfare, and they cared about social justice. And if there's one theme that's kept going today throughout the constituency, are those cares. So there are so many community groups that work so hard, and it's one of the wonderful things about being an MP and being a candidate is you get to see so much of them firsthand. And whether it's the food banks and the larders and the fridges, the sports teams, the day centres, the councils, the churches, you name it, it goes on and on and on. And that network of volunteers is what makes it tick. And they are particularly stretched now because our public services are so underfunded and so stretched. Witney is just 10 miles west of Oxford, and that makes it, for many, one of the reasons that makes it so wonderful to live, work and play there. And that cuts both ways. So we have got enormous pressure from housing. So many people have grown up there but cannot afford to live there anymore, and that is brutal. And then adding to that is transport, where we in our wisdom tore up the railway 50 years ago, and we are stuck on the A40, which now takes more than an hour most days to get between just those 10 miles between Witney and Oxford. And that then doubles down into health. So we've got great GP practices around the constituency, but our secondary healthcare is in Oxford, which is virtually impossible to get to, and that causes an enormous amount of stress. So what we are trying to do is get secondary healthcare out of that hub in Oxford, out to Witney, where we can have redeveloped council-owned land into better healthcare services, more social rent housing, and better further education provision. For the last 4 years, I've worked on the project to rebuild the railway linking Carterton, Witney, Ensham with Oxford. It's a huge project, but we have got an opportunity now, and one of the things that has made it harder and easier is our new government has just said West Oxford's got to take 62% more housing, and that by itself will be a disaster, and it's too high a number. But what we can do if we're clever is do what our Victorian forebears did, which is you can put your housing around your railway stations and use that to fund the railway, and that is what we are intent on doing, and that would get Witney to Oxford in just 16 minutes, so a cut in travel time of 70%. Now, our rivers were our original transport links, and they did very well for our blanket industry and our quarrying industries, but we have not returned the favour. So they are full of sewage, but we are very lucky to have one of the best advocacy groups in the country, WASP, otherwise known as Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, that have done a fabulous job of turning the light on Thames Water and really recognising how dire the situation is. And to give a measure of that, so Thames Water now has got £18 billion of debt, and it's got £1 billion of cash flow. It's in breach of its operating licences, but is allowed to operate by this government with impunity. The sooner that that company is put into special administration, the better. Our constituency also plays a major part in the defence of our country. We've got the biggest airbase in the UK at RAF Bryce Norton, just south of Carterton, and we've got the nation's Defence Academy at Shrivenham, in the south of the constituency. Since World War I, the women and men in my family have served our country. They fought for the Army, for the Navy, for the Air Force, for the Fleet Air Arm and the SAS. They've been awarded 1 MBE, 2 DSCs, 3 DSOs and a VC for their courage. One of the DSOs and one of the VCs was for saving lives rather than taking them. And that gives me a lot of respect for what the people in our forces, how they serve us. And at their best, that academy and that Air Force stands up for British values of democracy and human rights and rule of law. And what we need to do in our chamber here is make sure that we also stand up for those and make sure that we don't sell weapons to dodgy regimes. Today's motion is about Syria, and I fully support it because we need to get more humanitarian aid in there. 30 years ago, I visited Syria, and it was wonderful. I was invited to a wedding feast that evening by a chance meeting that morning, and the hospitality was fabulous. 9 years ago, a 2-year-old Syrian boy was washed up dead on a British beach, and this country's grief was enormous. There was a nationwide outpouring. And almost by accident, my family ended up taking quite a few Syrian refugees, and they stayed with us for over a year, and we still stay in very close touch with them today. And that taught us how one of the key things a government can do is make it easy for its citizens to help these refugees come in and integrate into our country and our society. And that's something that we really have done not very well at all. The other thing that it really brought home to me is when a government fails its citizens, it can go very, very badly wrong. And I think in our country we are complacent about how unlikely things can, things won't happen, that won't go wrong. And another trigger that brought me into politics was Brexit. And I started a business when I was 25. I built it over 24 years with colleagues. It ended up being a global business, 9 offices around the world, 7 in Asia, 100 people. And that was through thick and thin, and by hanging in there and trusting people to get things done. But then when Brexit hit, and then beyond that, we were taking out of the single market and the customs union, my experience of business was like, holy cow, this is really bad news. This is disastrous for our economy. It's not going to sink us overnight because we've got a lot of things going for us, but it is a slow puncture. And you see that today in our flat GDP figures, you see it today in our flat investment figures, and you see it in our chronically underfunded public services. Now, I blame our past government for that, but I also look across the benches and I'm shocked because what I see now is a new government defending those disastrous Tory policies of being outside the single market and being outside the customs union. And that is going to, I hear that we're pro-growth, but I'm like, how does that add up? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So I really hope, and I say this, in a spirit of kind of constructiveness, that we find a way to get out of that hole pretty quickly, because we owe it to our country to do so. So please, I'd love your help on that. Yeah. The people of the Witney constituency put me here, and they put me here to listen, and they put me here to learn, and anybody who's new in this chamber knows there's an enormous amount to learn. They put me here to speak up for them, but they also put me here to do things, and I've still got to figure out how to get things done here. But I look forward to working with people all around the House to do that. So, people of Witney, thank you again for voting me in to represent you. I will do my very best.
Hear, hear.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all say it's a real pleasure to follow the Honourable Gentleman from Witney. Thank him for his excellent speech. Don't agree with everything about the Brexit stuff, but that's by the way. but very pleased to have his contribution, and really pleased to see his very large family in the House. You've been a busy boy by the looks of it, Can I say, first of all, I wish to endorse, the Honourable Gentleman made some comments, and I just want to talk about that if I can. When the last government introduced the Syrian relocation scheme, in my constituent of Strangford, in my specific town of Honiton, we took 6 families in. Those 6 families are still there today. That scheme really worked, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it worked because, first of all, I think the people of Newton and my constituency of Strangford recognised that those people were desperate and needed help. And what that did, it brought together all of the organisations, it brought together the churches of all denominations together as one. It brought the housing executive together who have responsibility for housing. It brought voluntary groups and community groups together as well. And these were displaced Christians, families from Syria. And that's what I want to speak about if I can, just very quickly, Madam Deputy Speaker. And those families are there today. They've had children there. They live in their houses, and it's great to, just before the election, I had the occasion to meet some of them. And they've moved into new houses. They've got themselves jobs. And that happens, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the people of Strangford, the people of Ards, like the people of Witney and elsewhere, came together and saw the need and responded. And that, for me, is one of the wonderful things about my constituency, although it's not about making speeches, but I just want to make that comment to reinforce what the Honourable Gentleman has said about Witney. I very much welcome the Minister's place again and his commitment. I look forward, Minister, I suspect that we'll be in many debates together and many things, because this is a subject matter which I have interest in. Your colleagues round about you have similar subject matters as well, and we work together on many things which we can try to do. Sanctions are important, and why are they important? They're important throughout Syria because the pockets of conflict permit Christians in particular, I want to make a comment about them, they continue to be caught in crossfire. I'm the chair of the APPG for Freedom of Religious Belief. It's a really important issue for myself and indeed for many others in this House as well. For we speak up for those with Christian faith, those with other faith, and those with no faith, because that's what I believe, and that's what others believe in this House as well. So it's really important to have these issues on record. In many cases, Christians are deliberately targeted, for example, in Afrin, where Turkish-backed troops are reported to be targeting Kurdish Christians. Christians are particularly in danger in the Idlib province, which is still controlled by Islamic militants, and in Haska district in the northeast, where Turkish military and Turkish supported opposition forces are active. And why they always seem to pick the small ethnic groups, the small religious groups. They abuse the human rights and the humanitarian aid, which is so important. I want to make the point if I can to ensure, when it comes to humanitarian aid, if it's possible, Minister, and I understand the difficulties that there are, but if it's possible to ensure that the humanitarian aid does get to those small ethnic groups across Syria, especially in the north and the Kurdish areas, to ensure that the human rights abuses, the religious persecution, the murders, rapes and physical abuse of people there, when it comes to aid, that aid gets to the right people. Converts to Christianity as well are at risk across the country, but their situation is especially dangerous in the northwest and the northeast. The Honourable Lady for Rutland and Stamford referred to the drugs abuses that there are in Syria. I attend the prayer for breakfast event here whenever it's possible to do so. It's on a Wednesday. I think of the one this Wednesday, I suspect. But we had a speaker who came from Syria, and he told us about how Syria is rife with drugs amongst all sections of people, encouraged by the Russians who seem to be involved in all sorts of illegal activities in that country as well. But I think it's important that we recognise the difficulties in Syria, but we also recognise those ethnic and religious groups that particularly need humanitarian help. I know UK has in the past had a very, very strong relationship with Syria, but within the sanctions, what can we do, Minister, to help those ethnic groups and those religious groups? So the sanctions that are put forward, I fully support. I understand the reasons for it. And I know that if we are to address human rights and are to address and the support we give to ethnic groups and religious groups in Syria, then we do need to combat the brutal violence that the Syrian government is carrying out against its people. I suppose the question, Minister, is a simple one. What more can we do to help those Syrians who are under human rights abuses, who are subjected to persecution for their religious beliefs, and to help the women and the children and give hope? In this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, we always wish to give hope, and if you can, Minister, I think we'd all appreciate your thoughts on how we can do that. Thank you so much.
Before I call the Minister, can I please remind members not to use you, that means me, and also specifically not to refer to colleagues by their name. Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank the members of the House for their contributions and address some of the important questions they've raised, in particular in relation to Captagon, chemical weapons, whether or not we have the balance rights on sanctions versus enabling humanitarian aid. And then I'll take some of the freedom of religious belief questions briefly. I'd like to pay tribute to the maiden speech for the member for Witney. I'd like to particularly associate myself with his remarks about this chamber being a confusing place for a newbie. And so if it were me, Madam Deputy Speaker, who made the mistakes, I apologise. In relation to Captagon, we're closely monitoring the regime's links. It is deeply concerning, as you will, as the member will know. Apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker. In March 2024, we co-hosted a conference with Jordan. We're keeping this under close review, and I'm happy to write to the honourable member with further details. It is of real concern. Of concern too, obviously, is the chemical weapons situation in Syria. I was very pleased to meet last week with the Director General for the OPCW and to make a further voluntary contribution on Syria specifically in relation to the very significant issues that Syria poses in relation to chemical weapons. On the members' concerns about getting the balance right, this we think is the best.
Apologies to the gentleman. On that voluntary contribution that he made, would you be kind enough to write to me just for the details of that so I can understand fully what the contribution is that's been made? Thank you so much.
I'd be very happy to, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the issues raised by the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, I can assure the member that this will not provide any assistance directly to the government of Syria, and we go to great lengths in order to ensure proper compliance with our sanctions regime. On the strikes in Syria that were also referred to by the Liberal Democrats spokesperson, the protracted conflict risks clearly other regional tensions playing out. We've been clear with all parties that further escalation in the Middle East must be avoided at all costs and is in nobody's interest. In relation to the member of Strangford's remarks, I understand and welcome that we will be, I'm sure, facing each other across this aisle on many issues, and I recognise the member's personal commitment to freedom of religious belief issues. We have provided, I believe, £14 million of assistance on human rights monitoring in the conflict in Syria, and I know how desperate some of the human rights issues are in the country, and we will continue to keep them under close review. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope and trust the House will support the regulations, and I thank members for their input.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.